For centuries, Europe was shaped not only by wars and revolutions, but by families, dynasties whose names became inseparable from power itself. Among them, none were as influential or as tragic and as the House of Habsburg. At their height, the Habsburgs ruled over vast territories stretching across the continent: Spain and Austria, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy. And for generations, the title of Holy Roman Emperor rested almost permanently in their hands. They did not conquer the world through constant warfare alone. Instead, they mastered a different strategy, one quieter, more subtle, and ultimately more dangerous: marriage. While other dynasties fought for land, the Habsburgs married for it. Their alliances were carefully planned. Every wedding was a political calculation. Every union was meant to secure borders, inherit crowns, and keep power within the family. This strategy proved astonishingly successful at first. A famous saying emerged in Europe: "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." And for a time it worked perfectly. But power has a way of turning inward. And the same blood that once united kingdoms would eventually begin to destroy them. As generations passed, the Habsburg family tree did something unusual. It stopped expanding outward and began folding in on itself. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The same bloodlines crossed again and again, not by accident, but by design. To the rulers of the time, this seemed logical. Keeping marriages within the family meant keeping power pure, controlled, and undisputed. Outsiders could not challenge inheritance if they were never allowed inside. Yet nature does not obey political ambition. Slowly, quietly, the cost of this strategy began to surface. Not on battlefields, but in bodies and minds. Children were born weaker, illness became common, physical deformities appeared generation after generation, mental instability followed. Still the family pressed on, because to the Habsburgs, maintaining dominance mattered more than recognizing warning signs. They believed their bloodline was chosen, destined to rule. And when destiny is questioned, those in power often double down instead of stepping back. This is the story of how one of Europe's greatest dynasties rose to unimaginable heights, and how the very blood meant to preserve its power became its undoing. In this documentary, we will explore the history of the Habsburg family, their rise through strategic marriages, the hidden genetic consequences of centuries of inbreeding, and the slow collapse that followed, culminating in rulers so sick they could barely govern, and dynasties that could no longer continue. This is not a tale of scandal for shock's sake. It is a historical lesson about power, fear, and the human cost of trying to control fate. As we begin, let us step back into a world where crowns were inherited, bloodlines were sacred, and one family believed it could outsmart nature itself. Because the fall of the Habsburgs did not begin with war, it began at the altar. The rise of the Habsburgs. Marriage as a weapon. The rise of the House of Habsburg was not sudden. It was slow, deliberate, and carefully calculated. Unlike many royal families, the Habsburgs did not begin as mighty conquerors. In the early Middle Ages, they were a relatively modest noble house from what is now Switzerland. Their power was regional, their influence limited, but they understood something crucial long before others did. Land can be taken by force. Crowns can be seized through war. But legitimacy, true lasting authority, is inherited, and inheritance begins with marriage. By the late Middle Ages, the Habsburgs had refined a strategy that would change European history. They sought brides and grooms not for love, but for territory. Each marriage was a diplomatic contract, each wedding a silent annexation. When a Habsburg married into another ruling house, borders shifted without a single battle. Titles passed quietly. Claims were secured generations in advance. This approach allowed the family to expand faster and more safely than many of their rivals. One of the most decisive moments came in the late 15th century, when Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy. With this single union, the Habsburgs gained control over vast and wealthy territories in the Low Countries. Trade routes, cities, and economic power now flowed into their hands. It was a turning point. From that moment on, the Habsburg name became synonymous with strategic marriage. Their influence expanded further when their descendants married into the royal houses of Spain. Soon, the family controlled not only European lands but overseas empires as well, stretching into the Americas and beyond. By the early 16th century, the Habsburgs ruled over a realm so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. And they had achieved this not through endless war, but through weddings. Other dynasties began to fear them. How do you fight an enemy that gains power simply by arranging marriages decades in advance? The answer, often, was imitation, but no one matched the Habsburgs' discipline or patience. Yet this success carried a hidden flaw. To protect what they had gained, the Habsburgs grew increasingly wary of outsiders. Foreign marriages brought risks, rival claims, divided loyalties, unpredictable politics. So the solution seemed obvious: marry within the family. At first, this appeared harmless. Royal families across Europe were already closely related. A cousin here, a distant relative there. But over time, the Habsburgs narrowed their circle further and further. Each generation married closer kin than the last. What began as a weapon against external threats slowly turned inward. The same strategy that built the Habsburg Empire would later weaken it from within, not through rebellion or invasion, but through biology. At this stage, however, the warning signs were still easy to ignore. The empire was strong, the crowns were secure, and the belief that their bloodline was destined to rule remained unshaken. For the Habsburgs, marriage was not just a political tool. It was the foundation of their power, and unknowingly the seed of their future collapse. Inbreeding becomes tradition when bloodlines closed in. By the early 17th century, the Habsburg strategy had fully turned inward. Marriage was no longer just a tool of expansion. It became a mechanism of preservation. The family believed their power rested not only on land and titles, but on blood itself. Their lineage was seen as divinely chosen, a sacred line that must remain pure. And purity, in their view, meant keeping the bloodline within the family. Over generations, marriages between cousins became common. Soon, uncles married nieces, aunts married nephews. What had once been exceptional gradually became routine. From a political perspective, the logic seemed sound. No foreign princes meant no foreign claims. No outside queens meant no divided loyalties. Everything remained within Habsburg control. But nature does not respect political logic. Each generation inherited not only titles, but hidden genetic weaknesses. Traits that would normally disappear through genetic diversity instead became reinforced. The most visible symbol of this was the famous Habsburg jaw. Portraits from the period show the same features repeating again and again: elongated faces, heavy lower jaws, protruding lips. What began as a family resemblance slowly transformed into a deformity. Modern genetic studies suggest that this was the result of extreme inbreeding. The more closely related the parents, the more likely recessive traits would appear. But physical appearance was only part of the story. Many Habsburg heirs suffered from chronic illnesses. They experienced difficulty speaking, chewing, and breathing. Some were frail from childhood. Others struggled with fertility, producing few or no surviving children. Mental health issues also became more frequent. Depression, mood instability, and cognitive impairment were quietly documented by court physicians, though rarely spoken of openly. Royal courts were built on appearances. Weakness was hidden behind ceremony. Illness was explained away as divine testing. And yet, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One generation after another showed signs of decline. Still, the family persisted. The belief that their dynasty was chosen by God outweighed medical concern. Admitting that their marriage practices were harmful would mean questioning the very foundation of their rule. So the cycle continued. Marriage contracts were signed, genealogies were traced, not to avoid close relations, but to ensure them. In a tragic irony, the Habsburgs became trapped by the very strategy that had elevated them. The more they feared losing power, the tighter they held onto their bloodline. And with each generation, the cost increased. By the mid-17th century, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They had faces, they had names. And soon they would have a king whose very existence would come to symbolize the end of an empire. Charles II, the king who should never have been born. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the Habsburg bloodline had reached its breaking point. His family tree was not just tangled, it was collapsing inward on itself. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. But that was only the beginning. When modern historians reconstructed his genealogy, they discovered something astonishing. Charles II had the same genetic diversity as the child of a brother and sister. Generation after generation of intermarriage had erased the natural distance between relatives. From infancy, it was clear that something was wrong. Charles struggled to survive childhood. He could not speak properly until the age of 4. He did not walk until nearly 8. He suffered from seizures, digestive problems, and constant illness. His jaw was so pronounced that he could barely chew his food. His tongue was reportedly so large that speech was difficult and unclear. Court physicians documented his condition in careful, euphemistic language. Publicly, he was called weak. Privately, he was considered medically hopeless. Despite this, Charles became king at the age of 4. Spain, once the most powerful empire in Europe, was now ruled by a child who could not rule himself, and regents governed in his place while factions fought for influence behind the throne. The empire decayed quietly, slowly, drained by war, corruption, and indecision. As Charles grew older, his condition did not improve. He was mentally impaired, easily confused, and deeply religious, clinging to prayer as both comfort and explanation. He believed his suffering was caused by curses or demonic forces. At one point, exorcisms were performed on the King of Spain. Doctors bled him, purged him, and subjected him to brutal treatments that only worsened his health. None dared suggest the true cause: generations of inbreeding. The most devastating consequence came later. Charles II was unable to produce an heir. Despite 2 marriages, there were no children. No continuation of the Spanish Habsburg line. Europe watched closely. Without an heir, the future of Spain, its colonies, armies, and wealth, hung in the balance. When Charles II died in 1700 at the age of 38, his body was described as exhausted beyond recognition. An autopsy revealed organs that barely functioned. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg Dynasty ended. What followed was chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted across Europe, a conflict sparked not by ambition alone, but by the biological collapse of a royal family. Empires went to war because one bloodline had tried too hard to preserve itself. Charles II did not fail Spain by weakness of character. He was the final consequence of a system that valued blood purity over human health. His life was not a tragedy of one man, but of a dynasty, and his death marked the moment when the cost of inbreeding could no longer be hidden behind crowns and ceremony. The fall of a dynasty when Europe paid the price. The death of Charles II did not simply end a royal line. It destabilized an entire continent. With no Habsburg heir to inherit the Spanish throne, Europe was thrown into uncertainty. Spain controlled vast territories, not only in Europe, but across the Americas, Asia, and the seas between them. Whoever inherited Spain would inherit an empire. Charles II's final will named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince and grandson of the French king, Louis XIV, as his successor. This decision terrified Europe. A united France and Spain under one dynasty would shatter the balance of power. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German states refused to accept it. They feared domination by a single superpower, and they were willing to go to war to prevent it. In 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession began. What followed was more than a dispute over inheritance. It was a global conflict, fought across Europe, the Atlantic, and colonial territories. Hundreds of thousands died. Entire regions were devastated. Ironically, the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, distant relatives of the Spanish line, fought desperately to reclaim what their own bloodline had destroyed, but the damage was irreversible. Spain emerged weakened, stripped of territories and influence. Its golden age was over. The Habsburg name, once synonymous with power and stability, now carried a different meaning: decline. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs took notice. They had seen what unchecked inbreeding had done to their Spanish cousins. Gradually, policies changed. Marriages outside the immediate family became more common. The obsession with blood purity softened, not out of morality, but survival. The Austrian line endured longer, adapting to political realities rather than clinging to genetic isolation. But even they could not escape the weight of history. By the 19th century, the Habsburgs ruled a fragile, multicultural empire, struggling with nationalism and internal tension. The dynasty that once unified Europe through marriage now struggled to hold itself together. In 1918, after the First World War, the Habsburg monarchy collapsed entirely. No dramatic extinction, no final cursed king, just the quiet end of a dynasty that had ruled for over 6 centuries. The fall of the Habsburgs was not sudden. It was slow, systemic, and deeply human. Their decline reminds us that power built on rigidity eventually breaks. What began as a strategy, marriage as a weapon, became a prison of blood. Europe paid the price, not only in war and instability, but in lost generations, lost lives, and lost potential. The Habsburg story is not just about incest or genetics. It is about what happens when a system refuses to change, even when the cost becomes unbearable. Lessons of blood, power, biology, and human limits. The story of the Habsburgs is often told as a tale of kings, wars, and empires. But beneath the crowns and titles lies a far more human story. It is the story of a family that believed power could be preserved through control of land, of marriage, and ultimately of blood. For centuries, the Habsburgs treated marriage not as a personal bond, but as a political instrument. Each union was designed to secure territory, prevent rivals, and concentrate power within the dynasty. At first, the strategy worked. The Habsburgs became one of the most influential families in European history. They ruled across continents, commanded armies, and shaped the fate of nations. But biology does not negotiate with power. Each generation of close-kin marriage quietly increased genetic risk. What could not be seen at first began to surface slowly in physical deformities, chronic illness, infertility, and mental decline. These were not moral failures. They were biological consequences, yet the dynasty continued the practice, trapped by its own system. To break the cycle would mean risking political vulnerability, and so the cost was paid by children who never chose this destiny. Charles II became the most visible symbol of that cost, but he was not alone. Behind palace walls, countless Habsburg heirs suffered in silence. Their lives were shaped not by ambition, but by decisions made long before they were born. The fall of the dynasty was not caused by a single war or a single ruler. It was the cumulative result of generations refusing to adapt. History often celebrates strength, ambition, and dominance, but the Habsburgs remind us that survival depends just as much on flexibility. Power that cannot change becomes fragile. Bloodlines that close in on themselves collapse. Today, the Habsburg story is studied not only by historians, but by geneticists, sociologists, and political thinkers. It stands as a cautionary tale, not about royalty alone, but about systems that place ideology above human limits. In the end, the Habsburgs did not fall because they were weak, they fell because they believed they were untouchable, and history has a way of correcting that belief.